Good afternoon, and welcome to The Briefing, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvan-Manza, and I'm so excited to be joining our guest today to talk about the topic that has been on millions of people's minds since at least last month, rent. So last Friday, May 1st, tens of millions of Americans were unable to pay rent or their mortgages. Millions of Americans have lost their jobs. We've lost more jobs in a shorter period of time than at any point in American history, including in the Great Depression. And according to a recent poll, only about half of renters said they were confident in their ability to pay May rent. This is a crisis, and a growing chorus of voices are calling for a straightforward solution: cancel rent. We saw a wave of rent strike actions on May 1st in states including California, Missouri, Pennsylvania, New York. State and local leaders are enacting eviction moratoriums, but still there's a call for federal action. The public supports it. About 3 out of 4 voters support legislation that would suspend and forgive rent and mortgage payments. And such a bill was brought by Representative Ilhan Omar and others, the emergency rent and mortgage cancellation legislation. So I've got some amazing guests here with me today to discuss what happens next. We're joined by the former mayor of San Antonio, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and recent candidate for Democratic presidential nomination, Secretary Julian Castro. We also have Hillary Ronen, an elected member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors who recently participated in the San Francisco rent strike march and has been a champion of guaranteed housing since she was elected. And finally, we have Carroll Fife, the Oakland director of the Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment and a representative of Moms for Housing, a collective of unhoused and insecurely housed mothers organizing to reclaim vacant homes from real estate speculators. So I'd like to start with a little bit of context. More than 30% of renters could not pay a month ago on April 1st. Only 52% of renters said that they would be confident that they would be able to pay May rent a few days ago. We don't have the numbers back from May 1st yet, but as Robert Pinniger, the president of the National Apartment Association, put it yesterday, we're bracing for a far larger non-payment rate in May. Here's why. Since April 1st, unemployment has shot up across the country and most states are still locked down. Experts are predicting that April's unemployment rate will hit 16.1%. That's seriously a rate we haven't seen since the Great Depression. Tens of millions are unemployed and struggling, and with rent due on May 1st, millions of Americans unable to pay have organized rent strikes, which are collective actions to refuse rent payments until landlords meet the demands of tenants. We're seeing these rent strikes across the entire country: LA, Seattle, St. Louis, Portland, New York, San Antonio, Kansas City, Philadelphia, and Miami. Roughly 30 million Americans have sought unemployment aid. 10 million restaurant workers are out of work. We talked a little bit about this on Friday's briefing. And many are being denied unemployment insurance because of the unfair federal minimum wage laws that apply only to restaurant tipped workers. So there's been legislation since mid-April that would suspend and forgive rent and mortgages. The rent was due May 1st. Millions couldn't pay. Now what? So let's turn to Secretary Castro. Secretary Castro, first of all, we appreciate you so much for taking the time to talk to us about these issues. Now, you recently warned that people who get housing benefits from the government, including low-income people, elderly people, people with disabilities, are particularly vulnerable during this pandemic. And I want to play you a short video message from Victoria Enriquez of Los Angeles, who's been unable to work. She was a street vendor and a house cleaner, and so she's been out of work since the shelter-in-place order took place. She can't pay rent in May, and she's not going to have enough money for food. Let's listen.
Y le pedimos al gobernador que por favor congele las rentas y las hipotecas. Gracias. Hola, mi nombre es Victoria Enríquez. Soy de Los Ángeles, del Distrito 9, y soy vendedora ambulante y yo limpio casas, pero ya por el coronavirus perdí mi trabajo y debido a que he tenido problemas, no he podido acabar de pagar la renta y para el 1 de mayo definitivamente no voy a tener. Lo que tengo es para comer. Y le pedimos al gobernador que por favor congele las rentas y las hipotecas. Gracias. Hola, mi nombre es Victoria Enríquez. Soy de Los Ángeles, del Distrito 9.
I don't want to talk over Victoria, even if she's playing in the background. So Secretary, for those of our viewers, I'm not sure if we showed a live translation, but essentially Ms. Enriquez can't pay the rent because any money that she has, being out of work as she is, has to go to food. And she's asking the governor to please cancel the rents and mortgages. And my question for you, Secretary, is what would you say at this point needs to be done to help folks like Victoria? And what would you say to her and others like her who are struggling so much? Oh, and we need to fix your mute button. I want to hear every word you say.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, first of all, thank you very much, Emily, to you, to Now This, to the Justice Collaborative, to Supervisor Ronen, who I know is on the call, and Carroll, Fife, for all of her great work, and to everybody who's watching. What I would say to Victoria is that we need to provide the relief that she needs urgently, and we need to do that immediately. And what we see, and many people have said it, I'm not breaking new ground by saying this, but what we see out there is that it's folks like Victoria, especially the most vulnerable in our nation, that have been hurt the most during this coronavirus experience. Our frontline workers, whether they're farm workers or people working in grocery stores, but also people like street vendors that are already scraping by in so many different communities, who have already been the subject in places like Los Angeles of laws that have tried to sideline them and have made it more difficult for them to make a living. And now what we have is, as you mentioned, over the last 6 weeks, 30 million people who have filed for unemployment. We already had a housing affordability crisis, especially in communities like Los Angeles, where Victoria lives. Before this, the rents were rising, they're spiking. People were unable to juggle the cost of rent with the cost of food, with the cost of healthcare, and so many other things, paying 50, 60, 70% of their income in rent. $1,200 is not going to cut it. So what we need to do is that we need to immediately relieve that burden. An eviction moratorium plus direct rental assistance to people like Victoria and so many others who need it so that they can stay in their home.
I love that idea. And I actually wanted to talk to you about some of the federal solutions that are pending right now. So Representative Ilhan Omar was joined by Representatives Ocasio-Cortez and Tlaib and Presley and Jayapal and Pocan and putting forward this emergency rent and mortgage cancellation legislation. So this bill would cancel rent and mortgage payments. Instead of providing payments, a $1,200 payment and instructing them to pay their rent, it would actually cancel the payments until 1 year after the pandemic emergency is over. And that would allow the government to directly provide compensation to landlords and lenders. And we actually had a new report come out by Rutgers law professor Rachel Godsill with the Justice Collaborative Institute and Data for Progress, suggesting that both Democrats and Republicans across the country strongly support legislation like this, which was surprising even to me, that it was broad bipartisan support. More than 3 out of every 4 voters support, suspend, and forgive rent and mortgage cancellation programs. And more than 4 out of 5 support a ban on evictions, as you're talking about, and evictions and foreclosures. So you were recently talking about this legislation on MSNBC, and you used it as an example of what you called a balanced bill. So if you were in Congress right now, would you support a ban on evictions and foreclosures? And would you support legislation to cancel payments and provide direct compensation to landlords?
Yeah, I would. And I said the other day that it's what we need because we have so many people that are panicking. We have so many folks who in April either missed their April rent payment or they were late on it because they're scrounging, trying to, see how far they can go without, and make ends meet. In May, it's going to get even worse as more people find themselves unemployed, and folks that got unemployed last month, even if they got that $1,200 check, they're having to make that stretch even longer because they haven't gone back to work. And the bill does those two important things. Basically, it cancels rent, but it also recognizes that, you know, if you look at these landlords, a lot of landlords, the overwhelming majority of landlords, they own a single family residence that they rent out, or they own a duplex or a fourplex. They don't own 10,000 units or big apartment buildings. Some do, you know, and some that we can think of very easily, but that's not the typical experience for most landlords. And so I think the bill is thoughtful in saying we're going to address both sides of this equation, but that the priority immediately is providing direct relief to people like Victoria and so many others, families that are panicking. We know that housing is the most important thing that you can have to provide stability in your life. And in this moment of crisis, we need to make sure that families, that individuals, that they have that stability. And the bill is also thoughtful in getting us through this time period. It covers the next year, not just the next, 2 or 3 months, because you can't have just an eviction moratorium, but then people owe, 3 months worth of rent and it's due right after the eviction moratorium is over. What are they going to do? They're going to get evicted as soon as the landlord can evict them. That's not realistic. So we need to be thoughtful about how we approach this, and also be thoughtful about the fact that many of these landlords are small mom and pop kind of landlords, and it addresses their needs too.
So that actually kind of brings me to my next question about the lay of the land and the people who are out there involved in this situation. So Republicans control the Senate and Democrats control the House. So let's focus on the House for a second. The expectation is that Speaker Pelosi will release the House's proposal for the next COVID stimulus bill very soon. And when you're talking to our audience, to people out there, people like Victoria or people who want to get involved and do something to protect individuals who are suffering right now, what can people watching do right now to get rent cancellation and other programs like you've discussed into that bill? Or is there any news that voters should know about what's happening right now in Congress?
Well, look, use your voice. Healthcare, the Affordable Care Act is still around right now because unprecedented numbers of people called Congress on the cusp of when they were going to vote. Some of them were going to vote against it and do away with it. Your voice matters. In our democracy, that is still the most powerful thing that you have. However you can do that, emailing, calling. Some people still write traditional letters, which actually I think count for a lot because fewer people do it now. But everything that you can do. And also, as you know, Emily, and so many other people on this call realize that pay attention to housing issues. Too often times housing takes a back burner. It's on the back burner compared to so many other important issues, whether it's healthcare, jobs, immigration, education. We can't let housing be a back burner issue in this next election. So it's about pressuring your elected representatives to do the right thing and provide this kind of direct relief. But going forward, it's also about making sure that when you're considering that candidate that you're going to vote for city council or for state rep or for Congress or for Senate or president, that you're also asking that person, well, what are you going to do about housing concerns? Because it doesn't get brought up enough. And during the presidential campaign, I brought that up, that it had been about 30 years since a housing question was asked on a major debate stage. Fortunately, I think there were 1 or 2 questions asked ultimately, but that's not nearly enough.
It is the basis of so much stability for so many people. It is such an important issue. It is astonishing how infrequently it's addressed on the national stage. So I wanted to talk with you about that. You are the mayor of San Antonio, one of the largest and most diverse cities in the country. And there's several major communities of color and a population where about 60% of people identify as Latinx. And Black and Latinx people are a disproportionate percentage of renters. Can you talk to us about how the pandemic has impacted Black and Latinx renters and people paying their mortgages, and what more cities in particular can do to help vulnerable communities?
Yeah, my heart goes out to so many that I know right now are under tremendous stress. My brother Joaquin and I grew up with a single mom who, we were renting. I became the first in my family to actually own a home after I graduated from law school. And so we grew up with this experience. And right now, there are millions and millions of families, particularly Latinx, African American, and Native American families that are renting, that have borne the worst impact of this coronavirus. What I would say is that we need to, of course, continue to seek a federal answer, federal legislation. And fortunately, as you mentioned, Representative Omar and several others have sponsored legislation. There may be other legislation that comes forward soon as well. But your local community can do something too. Local communities like eviction moratoriums. San Antonio, my hometown, recently established a multi-million-dollar fund to actually provide up to, I think it was $2,500 in direct grants to families. Now, San Antonio is a city that is about 64% Latinx and 7% African American. It's a 70%, more than 70% minority. Check out what your local community is doing. And if you feel like they're not doing enough, then again, use your voice and try and make something happen in your local community, because we know that oftentimes that's easier than getting something done in Congress. I'd also say that we need to connect the dots. Right now, for the Latinx community and African American community, Native American community, the digital divide is playing itself out like never before, as our public school students are being given assignments that they're supposed to do online. We know that many of the jobs that have been lost, and also the jobs that people are still at, whether they're farm workers or grocery workers or nurses, it's these Black and brown communities that are working in them. So going forward, in terms of our policy, we have to connect the dots of all of these things and make the investments that it's going to take for greater prosperity and less inequality in this country.
So we're very, very lucky to have with us today Moms for Housing Representative Carroll Fife. And I want to introduce you to her and her to you. And she's here to talk to us about the grassroots movement for rent strikes and vacant home use that they've helped inspire across the country. So Carroll, I'd love it if you could talk to us for a minute about grassroots efforts to utilize vacant housing. Oh, we need to unmute Carroll.
I guess it's 2 for 2 today. Yeah, I think it's really important to just piggyback on what the secretary was saying about using your voice. We found that at the grassroots level, we've been able to push for monumental change that people didn't say was doable by especially women-led movements that are coming together to say enough is enough. We were able to lift up with the Moms for Housing campaign that there are 4 vacant units for every 1 unsheltered person in our city. And in Oakland, California, homelessness has skyrocketed to almost 50%, doubling in only 2 years, with thousands and thousands of people living on the streets. And so it's been through grassroots organizing that these issues have come to the fore, and people are just, understanding their worth and their value and demanding more. So it is through that type of organizing that we are changing the narratives around who deserves housing, who has access. We're actually changing policy and laws around what can happen. We passed one of the strongest eviction moratoriums in the state of California, and we're still moving. On April 1st, we had 15 buildings that were on rent strike in the city of Oakland, and that tripled. It more than tripled for May 1st. So when people are hurting, and when they're hurting enough, they'll figure out the solutions that they need to see in their lives, and that's what's happening on the ground.
That's really powerful. I wanted to talk with you. We just saw this video about Victoria Enriquez. And last week on the show with Representative Omar, we talked about a medical tech worker, Patricia Mendoza, who's a single parent. She had a 17-year-old and a 9-year-old, and her work was to transport elderly people to dialysis care. But she was fired in early April. And she's one parent among many that you've been working with, part of this statewide movement by struggling people, as you say, to cancel rent, when people get desperate enough to go on strike and also reclaim vacant homes. How have moms been impacted by the pandemic, and what do folks need both to get through the pandemic and to have a chance to thrive in the months and years afterwards?
I think we've heard it stated many times by many different people that the pandemic has exacerbated and highlighted the fractures in our society that already existed pre-COVID. So right now, one of the moms that we're working with, her name is Lachey, was driving part-time as a Lyft driver and had another job where she was, fighting to make ends meet. So she lost both of those positions and is now having to live out of a hotel where she pays $3,000 a month just to get locked out of her hotel room every week. Because if she's a minute late paying her weekly payments towards this rent. And we're finding it difficult for her to get back on her feet because you have to have 3 times the income to rent a place. You have to have a credit score of 700. And just, between those things, the down payment that you need, the work, the amount of money that you need to qualify for a place, 3 times the rent. It's just really difficult once you've experienced homelessness to get back into some type of stability. And so that's what a lot of the moms are facing. And until we address that the rents are too high in the first place, and that we shouldn't commodify what you need to survive and what you need to thrive in this culture, we're going to see the same issues happening over and over again. We really need to restructure how we see housing and how we engage with housing in this country.
So I wanted to turn to Secretary Castro for a final word about what Carroll's talking about with regard to ordinary people needing not only to weather this crisis and find a place to take refuge and survive, but also to thrive. I want to see, we are on Zoom here, and I feel like we may have lost the video feed for the Secretary. So before I turn to question him, let me make sure that we can all see his face here. It might take us a minute to check in with him. So we'll move on to talking to our other very, very exciting elected official, Supervisor Hillary Ronen of San Francisco's District 9. So I'd like to bring her into the conversation to talk about cities and counties. She's been calling for rent cancellation in San Francisco for more than a month. So Supervisor Ronen, you were recently at a rent strike march in San Francisco, and you've been fighting against gentrification and homelessness, which have been really hot button topics in San Francisco for a long time. Thank you for joining us, first of all. And second of all, would you like a moment to respond to what Carroll's talking about how people don't just survive, but thrive?
Absolutely. Thank you, Carroll, for all your extraordinary work. I cheer you from across the bay all the time. So it's such an honor to be here with you today. Everything that Carroll's talking about is happening in San Francisco and all over the country. There's no place that isn't struggling. I mean, if you look at the statistics, prior to COVID-19, 78% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, 78% of Americans, including members of my family. And when work stops, when that paycheck stops, where does the food come from? How do you pay your rent? I mean, any small disaster, any unexpected bill is devastating. And the fact that Americans, the vast majority of Americans, are living with this much insecurity prior to the COVID-19 crisis, it is just so wrong to begin with. We have fundamentally failed as a society to meet the basic needs of human beings, to housing, healthcare, quality education, and food. And what we're seeing in this crisis in a mass scale all at once is that failure and that underlying absence of a social safety net that works for everyone. explode. And for the first time, I mean, Moms for Housing and the takeover of the vacant unit in Oakland happened prior to the COVID-19 crisis. And we were organizing and fighting mass displacement in San Francisco prior to the COVID-19. If anything, that mass displacement has paused for a moment because of the incredible eviction moratoriums that have happened in Oakland and San Francisco being among the strongest, that you really cannot evict at this point for pretty much any reason, which is phenomenal. But the stress of that accumulating debt that's building is traumatizing. It's weighing on people. It's forcing people to perhaps go out and do dangerous jobs that they wouldn't otherwise do if they didn't have this unbelievable debt accumulating on their books. And during the biggest crisis, certainly of our lifetimes, but perhaps in history in this country, we need to relieve this mounting debt and the stress upon Americans. And we know how hard it is to get things done in Congress. We know that this president does not represent the interests of ordinary people. So it's incumbent upon us at the local level, both at the city and county level, but also at the state level, to step up. And we are asking and begging and demanding all of the above, our governor, to step in where the president won't and say, we're not going to leave you alone. You will not be displaced once the shelter-in-place order is over. You can relax at this moment because we truly are in this together at the local and the state level, and hopefully we'll get some help from the feds. You are not going to end up on the street, and you are not going to end up in foreclosure. And if you're a small landlord, you're not going to end up not being able to meet your bills because we are relieving your tenants of this incredible burden. And we are asking at this time, while we're supporting all these bills going through Congress, thank goodness we have leaders like Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Representative Jayapal. I mean, thank goodness for them is all I have to say. The women, right? Getting it done always. And we have faith in them, and they're going to win, and we know they're going to win.
We seem to have lost sound for Supervisor Ronen. There you go.
Sorry about that. And I'll end here. In the meantime, we need to provide some security and some assurance and relieve some of that stress by assuring Californians that no matter what happens on the federal level, we are here and we are ready and we are prepared to step in.
So that's actually something I'd love to ask you both about, and talking about assuring all Californians, and maybe using that as a model to assure all people in the US, everywhere, that nobody is going to be harmed in this context. And I want to talk about the resolution you've introduced, Supervisor, in a moment, but I wanted to start with this report you recently co-authored with Professor Rachel Godsill for the Justice Collaborative Institute and Data for Progress. And in that report, you revealed not only that more than 1.5 million people in California spend more than half of their income on rent, but that 150,000 people or more are experiencing homelessness right now as we speak. That's equivalent to a quarter of the population of the state of Wyoming. So your report found that about 3/4 of voters in California support a suspend and forgive program for rent and mortgages. And I wanted to start by talking with what you just mentioned about reassuring landlords as well as renters and people paying mortgages. Can you talk a little bit, both of you, about what sort of protections make this broadly functional with everyone, not just people paying the rent and paying the mortgages, but people who are perhaps, as the secretary mentioned, small mom and pop landlords who actually are depending on that money for their own survival?
Sure. Should I go first, Carol?
Go ahead, and then we'll go to Carol. She's
okay, great. it's an interesting time. My parents still live in the rent controlled apartment in Los Angeles that I was born in. They've been living there for 44 years, revealing my age. And I always say, my mom was a teacher. Thank goodness for her teacher pension and that rent controlled apartment that they're not living with me. Otherwise, they'd be with me right now because they can't survive off Social Security. There's no way. And so I'm a huge tenant rights champion. And usually when passing cutting edge tenant rights legislation, you're kind of at loggerheads with landlord community. And I feel for the first time in fighting for a global solution here, the landlord's interests are aligned with the tenant's interests, because just like tenants can't pay rent right now, a ton of landlords can't pay their mortgage. And many small landlords, again, we're not talking about the big corporate landlords, we're talking about the mom and pop landlords. They rely oftentimes on that rent to survive as well. So we have to look at this in a global way. We can't separate these interests in this time. And what I always like to say is it's fascinating that the Federal Reserve, the first act out of the federal government responding to this crisis was to give a 1.5 trillion bailout again to the big banks, right? It's always the big banks that get the assistance first. Well, if they're the first, then pass it on. Forgive and stop mortgage payments, no interest, no penalties, then let landlords pass that on to the tenants, right? This has to all happen in conjunction in order to work. And that's the type of program and leadership that we're looking at. That's the type of program that's being promoted by Representative Omar in DC and her colleagues. We, for once, are looking, and that's, if there's one bright side out of this horrible crisis, it's that we're looking at systemic change. We're not just looking at the band-aids that we're constantly placing on the fundamental fact that our system is broken. We are looking at fixing the whole, and I'm hopeful that something good, not just responding to this crisis, but responding to the crisis, as you've said, that has existed in this country for a very long time and is really, really acute in California, where 50 to 60% of people's income go to their rent.
Carroll, I know you also had thoughts on this question of how to bring everyone to the table and get a better outcome here.
Well, some of the legislation that we're working on to ensure that all Californians have access to housing is the right to housing, or housing as a human right constitutional amendment for the state of California. I think it's imperative that everyone, no matter their income, has housing access. I mean, it is foundational to all other indicators of health. Housing is health. And I think it's also important to mention that that we got it wrong with the foreclosure crisis. The big banks got to keep properties as well as getting a financial bailout. And so we have to bail out people this time. And anything else will just be, it's becoming so apparent that people are not valued. Working class people are not valued. We see frontline workers without the PPEs that they need to continue to help our economy just stay in some fashion on track, and we're just not valued. So the legislation that we're trying to push right now statewide will give everyone access to housing in the same way that a constitutional amendment gave everyone access to water, because it's one of the things that we need in order to live.
And how have elected officials reacted? Because that, to me, that's a really compelling argument. This is a fundamental survival need. And what's the reaction or the response that your movement has gotten to that point?
It's been supported by some electeds in our statewide assembly, but it's also gotten some criticism. There's fear that it won't be able to get out of the housing committee because people want to continue to add language that emphasizes building. And we've said for years that we cannot build our way out of a housing crisis. There are vacant units now. There are protections that can be implemented now, versus, this whole building approach. In Oakland, we've seen 200% of our market rate housing produced, with under 25% of affordable housing produced. So it's not just a question of building, it's a question of who are you building for? Because it's not affordable. It's not affordable to most working people in my city, where the housing wage is $40.88 per hour is what you would have to earn to afford a median 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. So if we're building, but we're not building for what's needed, then what are we doing and who are we serving? So unfortunately, even though we have a legislature that's blue, we're not seeing the kind of leadership necessary to get us past this crisis.
So you brought a lot of people together into this movement in Oakland, in Alameda County. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how you did that, because the moms you're working with are already in stressed circumstances. There are moms who are dealing with more demands on their ability to survive than they can handle. That's the root of the movement. So how did you get people organized and working together for change?
I think it's 2 decades of relationships that we were able to bring to bear with some folks who really believe in grassroots organizing. So I think it's just networks. I think it's the time that all of these things are converging at once, where we're seeing mass gentrification, but also lack of income that people need to earn to afford to live in these places. I think it's all of the things that are coming together at one time that are just creating this environment of organizing. So it's people who are environmentalists, people who are teachers, like our union folks, our workers, just average people, all understand that this is so foundational that we all have to speak with one voice around issues concerning housing. It impacts all of us.
And if you were each going to speak with one voice, this is a question for both of you, to Governor Newsom. I'd like you to talk for a minute about what more Governor Newsom can do right now, and what communities would rapid action help the most? What would the sort of fallout of that action be? Carroll, let's start with you.
Governor Newsom needs to stop shifting the responsibility of a statewide housing crisis to localities. And we need to have one general across the board plan to deal with rent cancellation and mortgage relief. If you leave it up to individual jurisdictions, it gets really confusing. He needs to cancel the debt, period. And the people that are most impacted are the people who've been most impacted, which in my community are Black folks. 70% of the people living on the streets of Oakland are African American. And that is because of a history and legacy of discrimination in housing. And our undocumented folks who don't get the relief of like a stimulus check, but who are some of our most important frontline workers, our farm workers, all of the folks who work to make this country amazing, but don't get the support. Those are 2 communities that would see a huge benefit if the governor actually pushed for policy that would help the most marginalized during this time right now.
Supervisor Ronen, what would you say Governor Newsom needs to do right now?
Yeah, I would agree with Carroll. Put forth a realistic plan. First of all, make clear that rent and mortgages are canceled in the state during the period of this shelter-in-place order where people are not able to work, and to come up with a plan for the long term to build the affordable housing we need. I could not agree with Carroll more. There is a counter movement to our movement in the state of California. that somehow believe that if they build enough housing, period, without any rent or affordability restrictions, that somehow is going to trickle down and lower rents to an extent that the everyday minimum wage earner is going to be able to afford those apartments. And it's fantasy. It's absolute fantasy. The builders who are out to make obscene profits and their funders and financiers who demand 20% profits at minimum are only able to build if they charge either sale or rent outrageous prices. And they're going to stop building if they can't get those returns. So it doesn't even make sense in theory that someday, prices are going to lower. It's pure fantasy. But this YIMBY movement, which is, somewhat of a front piece for the developers and those that want to make money off housing, they have gotten the ear and really, if you listen to Governor Newsom, if you listen to Assembly Member David Chu, who's the head of the Housing Committee in the Assembly, or Scott Wiener, who both of them are our representatives in San Francisco, who have pushed several versions of this by right housing to take away community voice and just ram these projects through. They're never going to take care of the people that are really suffering. And the people that are really suffering are the communities that Carroll talks about. They're communities of color, they're low-income communities. There are service workers, our teachers, our construction workers, our nurses, it's the middle and working class of the state. And the middle class can't afford housing either anymore. It's not just the working class. And government's going to have to build housing again, or we're going to have to subsidize it. If nonprofit, builders and organizations are the one to build. But we can't rely on the market to fix this problem. It's not going to work. It's not going to happen. Government needs to step in, and we need a plan for building fast as much affordable housing as we possibly can, because that's the only solution to homelessness. Is housing. And the only way that's going to get done is if government steps in and does it. Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute. Sorry.
Now I've done it. I'm the only person who hadn't done that yet. And I was just saying that the only solution to homelessness is housing. That makes a lot of sense. It's a strong moment for us to thank you both and to thank our audience for joining us today. Thanks to Secretary Castro, Supervisor Ronen, and Carroll Fife for your time. We hope that everyone will join us tomorrow for another edition of The Briefing, brought to you by The Appeal and Now This News, with guest speakers Congressmember Rashida Tlaib and others. My name is Emily Galvin Almanza, and I hope you all have a safe and pleasant day.